Hey everyone, welcome back to Let's Talk Hope. Let's Talk Herps. I'm your host Stephen Lewis, and today's topic is serious but super important. We're talking about spotting and reporting reptile abuse, specifically in reptiles. We love reptiles. We love sharing them with the world, but unfortunately, not everyone treats reptiles with the care and respect that they deserve. I put out a video on this topic before, and it's something I deal with on a regular basis at work. But I did want to bring in this to a discussion to really help bring a dark subject to light. To help us talk about this, I've invited someone who is an expert on animal welfare and enrichment, the one and only Lori Torrini of Behavior Education and Spirit Keepers Sanctuary. Lori, thank you so much for being here.
Hello, Stephen. Thank you. I'm happy to speak. I'm always happy to chat with you.
Thank you, thank you. So let's jump right into it. We'll start with the basics, uh, and we can. I don't want to say this. We can give your resume if you want, or you can just sort of answer the question, however you want to go through it.
Well,
But
let me tell,
yeah,
because this isn't something I routinely speak about. I'm
yeah,
usually speaking about animal behavior and training and enrichment and things like that with multiple species. But so let me just give you a little bit of my background with animal abuse and neglect, because I've seen this from several different perspectives. And so, from one perspective, I worked for more than 20 years as a veterinary receptionist and assistant. Part of those 20 years were full time, and then part of that was just part time. And I actually worked 6 years in an animal emergency center. I worked at night. I've always liked working nights. And we would get sometimes, unfortunately, animal abuse and neglect cases brought in to the emergency hospital, or even regular veterinary practices that I've worked with have seen neglect and abuse cases. So I've seen it from the medical perspective. I've also unfortunately seen it from the law enforcement perspective. I retired as a Colorado Springs police officer after 20 years. And part of my duties during that time included animal law enforcement. There was a period of time where our contracted animal law enforcement organization changed, and the one that the city hired, they were not empowered to do felony cases, and so that fell to the police department working with animal law enforcement. And I did quite a few of those cases. But any police officer in Colorado Springs can charge animal cruelty or neglect, and that's what the statute is here. It's 18.9.201 and 202 in the state of Colorado. So I can really only speak to Colorado here. But so, for example, if I went on a domestic disturbance, sometimes pets were involved, and sometimes, unfortunately, those animals were abused along with the people in the household. So I have enforcement experience with animal cruelty and neglect investigations and the arrests. And then since retiring from there, I've worked in animal rescue. I worked with Ruby Ranch Horse Rescue, and now I work with Spirit Keeper Animal Sanctuary. And so on this end of things, I get those animals after they've been abused, neglected, or the experienced cruelty, and they've been through the law enforcement process, or they've been voluntarily relinquished by the individuals, and then they come to the rescue or the sanctuary. So I've kind of seen the situation through all three of these lenses, and that's where I'm here tonight to talk to you from.
perfect. Thank you. And that's yes. So for those who don't know, I also have a background in animal control. That's what I do my 9 to 5 here in the state of California. It's not something I talk about too often because I'm not allowed to really discuss the department or anything to that effect as a an active employee. But it is something that it's a topic that we broach a lot. And so that's why I'm really glad to have you on the channel to bring sort of some of our conversations that are behind the scenes just out onto YouTube. And really discuss kind of what we see in social media, because that's really where a lot of this plays out in terms of herpetoculture. A lot of it exists online, and a lot of that exists in social media. And so I kind of want to just bring those worlds together and see if we can't figure out how people can really make a difference if they're seeing something that's not appropriate, or really just give them information on what they should be looking for and that sort of thing. So to you, Lori, what actually does count as animal abuse or neglect? And to follow up, how do we tell the difference between a keeper who's maybe just uneducated versus someone who is truly mistreating their animals?
That's a great question. And so there's a couple of ways that you need to look at this through the legal lens. You're going to have to look at your jurisdiction or your state statutes, because they're going to be specifically defining what animal cruelty, abuse, or neglect is. And those are going to be what law enforcement or animal law enforcement is looking at when they go and investigate an alleged case. So that's going to be outlined specifically in the statute. And normally that's going to be not providing the basics like food, water, appropriate environment, medical care. That's going to be neglect. And I'm just giving you this in broad terms right now
Sure.
because the statutes are going to specifically state what these things entail. And then abuse usually entails some type of physical battery, hitting an animal, physical harm or pain caused to an animal. And then in Colorado, we also have aggravated animal cruelty, which would be, I hate to even say mundane abuse, but let's say that I kick a dog, that's going to be animal abuse. But if I do other things, there are aggravating factors if I do other things to a dog or any other animal. And I have unfortunately worked those felony cases, which are just so egregious that I really am not going to mention them here.
Yeah.
And usually there is knowingly inflicting animal cruelty or neglect. There is recklessly inflicting animal cruelty and neglect. And then there's negligently doing that. And so knowingly means I'm on purpose torturing and abusing this animal. I'm on purpose starving it because whatever reasons people have for doing these things. Reckless would be I'm engaging with my animal in some kind of behavior that I should know could potentially harm the animal, and I'm just being reckless about it. And if we equate that to driving, if I knowingly run you over with my car, that's on purpose. That's a goal-directed behavior. I knowingly do that. If I'm driving recklessly just because I'm excited to drive super fast and I want to see how fast I can go around this curve and I hit you, that's reckless. I didn't intentionally hit you, but I was being extremely reckless and should have known that happened. And then negligent is, I didn't mean to. Maybe I didn't even know that this could cause death or harm, but I did it, and it did cause death or harm. So those are kind of the three things the law is going to look at.
And I do find that usually when we're talking about the negligent or the neglect aspect, that there also has to be it doesn't necessarily have to be someone has to know that this is a harm. For instance, keeping a animal without medical attention for many months, and then it passes away. So they don't have to know that the animal had crypto. They don't have to know that it had a respiratory infection or how it got it and that sort of things. But there needs to be some level of understanding that the animal is unwell, and that instead of going to fix it at that point, they decide to do nothing.
Correct.
Yeah. So because there is some small leeway for complete and total ignorance, I find, when it comes to animal laws.
If you're not giving your
it's
animal
very small.
Food and water, let's say the snakes that we got surrendered to us in April, they knowingly didn't have food and water. The person who had those snakes knowingly was not giving them food and water. I mean, that is something we all know, that any living organism needs sustenance. And so if you're knowingly not providing sustenance, that's going to be abuse. That's going to be criminal negligence or criminal neglect. But if, the animal's sick and I choose to just kind of ignore it and see what happens, and I know something's not right with the animal, but I don't really want to take it to the vet, and I'm just going to wait and see what happens, that's going to be where you're leaning more towards negligence.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it out. And then for some of the reckless too, we always, when I teach new officers the different statutes in California, there's knowingly abusing an animal and willfully abusing an animal, exactly like you mentioned, punishing animals that, to extremes, physical abuse that we all think of. But then there's also dog in a hot car, where someone did a really foolish, simple thing, or a snake in a hot car. We've had those calls before too.
Or a child in a hot car, which
same,
unfortunately we see deaths more than I would like to say of
Mm,
dogs and children in hot cars because people go get their nails done and think I'm just going to leave the dog in the car for 20 minutes, or I'm going to leave my child in the car while I run in and do this, get my hair cut, and now the child or the dog is deceased. And I've seen those in the news literally this past week.
yeah, it's I have a number of friends who are social workers, and people will tell me things, say, I don't know how you could deal with these abuse cases. How does that, it's hurtful, and it hurts your soul a little bit. It taxes you. But I just
But that's
remember,
a great example you gave of a snake in a hot car, because how many people have purchased an animal at a
yeah,
reptile expo and put it in the car and then gone back into the reptile expo and come out and the animal's been
yeah.
dead.
Yeah, and you hear it all the time with some sensitive animals. Certain geckos that really and frogs and amphibians that really can't get over 80. But a lot of people may not realize if it's 80 degrees outside, it could be 120 inside of your vehicle. Uh,
Absolutely.
and
But there's other risks to leaving animals, any living thing in a vehicle. And my rule is just a living thing is never left unattended in my
yeah,
vehicle. So if I'm on the way back from the vet and my husband says, "Can you stop and run an errand?" No, I can't. And that's my answer to him always is no, I cannot. Unless I can stop at the store and they bring it to the car, I will not do that because I am not leaving any live things in the car unless I'm physically there, because I can't control the environment. What if the car gets stolen? What if it gets broken into? I'm just not going to put a living thing at risk like that. It's not happening.
no, absolutely right. I think that's the safest course of action. Anytime you want to make a decision, is this going to be okay? Just do the easiest thing for that animal and go there. I also worry a lot of times, if I'm getting a snake. I live in Southern California, weather's really
Mhm.
nice, but let's say I live somewhere where the weather isn't really nice, and I'm bringing a snake home somewhere, and I keep my climate control on at 70, but overnight the temps are at 10 or 5 or below that,
Mhm.
and that snake gets loose, and I don't find it before those temperatures drop. I probably won't find that snake until I smell it, because it's going to die overnight, in some place
Right.
hidden, and things like that too. So it's always a crucial example to keep your eyes on the snake. And maybe that's something that's a reckless keeping. Maybe it's an accident too, right? That's when law enforcement sort of has to determine, who's to blame. Is this a genuine mistake that could happen to anybody, or were you being reckless? And it can go a lot of ways. So
And I know one of the things that at least we would look at is this the first time this happened, or
mhm,
have you had prior incidences of this same thing happening where you should know and now it's reckless because you
yeah.
knew this could happen. You did this before and now you've done it again. So that is no longer negligent. Now it's reckless because you knew that this could happen.
Yeah, and you'll hear it when you're interviewing abusers too, and suspects, and they say things like, "I knew it was wrong, but I decided to stop right there." That's your lawyer would advise you to not say
Yes.
that. I am all for it, but your lawyer would say don't say that because you're admitting that you knew better, and
Correct.
that's when it becomes a problem. Um, uh, Kind of in that line, for reptile keepers specifically, what are some red flags that maybe we should be looking out for? Maybe in enclosures, in feeding
Mhm.
practices, or animal behavior that might signal abuse or serious neglect.
Yeah, that's a really great question because especially with snakes and some other reptiles, you know, they don't need food 3 times a day. They can go without water for a few days. So let's say, I mean, I don't do this, but let's say for some reason you change waters once a week. And so the water bowl happens to be dry or just barely damp the day I come to inspect. That
Hmm.
doesn't necessarily mean that you've neglected your animal, because maybe legitimately the next day is the day that you refill all the waters.
Hmm.
And your snake physiologically, if it ran out of water 2 days ago, is going to be okay for that period of time. Maybe I happen to inspect on a day when there's a pile of feces and urates in there, but clearly it's one pile and one urate. And so you haven't got to cleaning day yet. That's a lot different than if I go and I'm looking through a facility and I'm looking at enclosures and there's just filth everywhere. Like there's
Yeah.
numerous piles of feces, there's numerous piles of urates, and it's clearly very old. and the water dish is bone dry and got like maybe calcium buildup on it, where clearly there has not been water in it for some time. And then in addition to that, I look at the animal and it's dehydrated. It's thin or emaciated. It's not exhibiting normal species typical behavior. It's not ambulating properly. It's not behaving as I should. Then that is a sign to me that the conditions I'm seeing in the habitat are probably long-term conditions, and that's going to indicate long-term neglect versus just I only do maintenance once a week and you happen to come the day before I do maintenance. I think that you should be able to tell the difference between long-term neglect and just this person isn't on top of their maintenance, but they do it like once a week.
Yeah.
And while I try to spot clean every day and refresh waters every day, not everybody does, and that's not necessarily going to kill your animal or be harmful to your animal.
Yeah, that's a great thing to point out too, because different things look different to different people. And it's also important to understand what species we're looking at as well.
Mhm.
For instance, my rosy boa has a big water dish. I shouldn't say big because compared to some other snakes, it's very small. But it's a water cup, plenty of water for him to drink. And when I give it to him, he will absolutely just drink a lot of it. He absolutely uses it. This is a desert species that many keepers don't even provide water
I
to.
know.
I don't agree with that. However, knowing that species, that's not likely something that's going to result in harm to that animal to a great detriment, so long as it does in fact get its hydration. I would argue that it could be better hydrated if it doesn't have
And
water.
I think that's a really good point because let's say with humid hides, I
Mm,
tend to moisten mine, wait until it completely dries out, and then moisten it again because that's more of a natural cycle
yeah.
than just keeping it moist all the time. And so if I inspect you and maybe you do that with your rosy bow's water, you fill the water and then you wait till they drink it all and then you fill it again. None of those things are unreasonable depending on the species that you're keeping. But if it's clearly evident that that enclosure hasn't been maintained in weeks or months, that's an issue. And you're going to see piles upon piles of feces, urates, um, maybe dried liquid urine. Uh, it's clear that there's not been water in there in a very long time because of deposits on the dish and it's bone dry. Maybe you even see dead rodents in there or other dead animals in the enclosure, depending on the species and if it's cohabiting with something. Those are
Mm,
all clues that that's going to be neglect versus just, I haven't cleaned yet this week. I mean, that should
yeah.
be pretty evident to people, I think.
I think that's a good point, that there's a big sort of um, there's a lot of little red flags that we could point out and be like, oh, and I think we do this a lot on Facebook when people want to criticize cages. You need to get that shed out of there. I could see urates, your glass is dirty. And then boom, jump to that's abuse,
Right.
which listen, it might be on the path to that. This might be a person who could be capable of such a thing, but I don't know if we're there yet. Usually when we're talking about cases that are actually abused animals and cases that are actually prosecutable, it's like you said, it's weeks and months of feces buildup.
Or
My
is
rate,
there one shed in there or are there 10 sheds in there?
right, right. There, I rehomed a Brazilian rainbow boa at the start of the year. That was just on a local, like a Craigslist type. It was the OfferUp app, and it was this adult female, and I ended up keeping her, and she's doing really well. But when I got her, she was just in a 30-gallon tank, and there was at least 3 or 4 piles of poop, which isn't a ton. But knowing that this animal, I asked him how often he ate, says it ate every month. So there was at least 2 months worth of feeding that had gone by without cleaning up any of the waste. And it wasn't a big cage. It was bone dry. And the animal has all kinds of scars and was very dehydrated, had layers of stuck shed on her. Um, and frankly, I was shocked that because this animal is showing all the signs of abuse, and or I should say neglect. However, she was eating, and I think she was getting a lot of hydration from that. I took her to the vet, and ultimately, there was nothing wrong with her whatsoever. He said, "Yeah, obviously she's dehydrated." and needs to continue to rehydrate. But it looks like all signs are going to point towards a good recovery. She doesn't have any, I don't hear any breathing issues or anything like that. And it reminds me of a lot of times, especially with reptiles, because there is such little knowledge in the general public about them. And in this case, if we're talking about city attorneys and district attorneys, it's very unlikely that one of them is a snake keeper. And if
Correct.
so, it's very unlikely that they're a knowledgeable snake keeper on top of that. So to get an actual case against something like that, there needs to actually be, on top of all these signs, there needs to be something wrong, in fact, with the animal. There could have been because of this snake, because she had all kinds of scars and things like that from rat
Mhm.
bites. So perhaps they could have charged anything there, but it wasn't worth going down that road at all, in my opinion, because of the condition of the animal overall being close to healthy. It's hard to call her healthy, but she's healthy now, and the fact that she was able to make a recovery, I think, makes a big difference too. So that's
Yeah, and I know our statutes, and I was just going to check, specifically says that the standard of care that is accepted for that species, breed, or type. And so, in that case, to prosecute a case, you have to be able to articulate what's appropriate for that species,
mhm.
which you and I could if we were investigating like a snake neglect case.
Yeah.
I mean, because we could pull up husbandry data, we could pull up scientific papers, and we could take that to the district attorney and say, this is the norm, this is what's expected, this is not what this person was doing. But you have to be able to justify and articulate that. It has to hold up once you get to court. And also in our state, it's called cruelty and neglect. And in some states, it may be called abuse. So I wanted to be clear that cruelty and what that looks like versus neglect is going to be some overt physical um, injuries that were inflicted on purpose by a human being.
Mm.
And unfortunately, I've seen that. So that's going to look different than rats biting it unless you've deliberately like fed your snake to your rats.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Great points. And I think it's another reason these words are legally defined: cruelty, abuse, neglect, negligence. They're legally defined words, and so it's not something that I try to use lightly when interacting with anyone online. I'll say things like it could be considered abuse. This is neglectful or neglectful behavior or something along those lines, because frankly. Uh, Labeling something directly as abuse or neglect requires a little bit of evidence, which we don't always have. And I think that's kind of the the hard thing to gather around. I've gotten into a lot of um, I guess disputes online, and one of the common ones is about UV lighting for snakes. And the defense that I'm very pro it. I think it's a very beneficial topic. However, when people are defending themselves against my arguments, they'll often say, like, "Listen, I'm not abusing my animals. I'm not neglect." And I want to be clear, like that's not the accusation I'm making. In some cases, something like UV light is about bettering welfare for the
Right.
animal. It's about improving the way that they live, and just giving them a more natural environment. When I talk about things like neglect and cruelty, it's a legally defined term. So it's specifically about actions that the keeper has taken that are causing harm to an animal, and
Right.
not providing a light, while I think they could do better and make an animal healthier, doesn't meet those standards.
Right. It has to be articulable detriment to the animal, which, like, you don't give it water, it's going to eventually die. You don't give it food, it's going to eventually die. So it's causing detriment to the animal, harm to the animal. And you have to be able to articulate that your action will cause that harm to the animal. Where right now we're not in a position with evidence that withholding UVB from a snake is detrimental and harmful to them.
Right. And great. And so I think the, uh, jumping back to something that was mentioned just briefly, we talked about the recent rescue of the snakes that we took in, and sorry, we that you took in over at Spirit Keeper, and that was a part of a sort of a concerted effort with the local law enforcement from the other state, and I was just hoping you could talk a little bit about that. What are some of the symptoms you see in these animals that show that they were neglected or victims of abuse?
The number one thing, and wasn't on scene. So two of our volunteers, Joy and Paul, actually went to the scene, and they met with law enforcement there, and they worked with law enforcement as well as with the snake's owner at the time to remove those snakes from the residence and transport them to Spirit Keeper Animal Sanctuary. So I wasn't on scene. I saw photographs, and then I've obviously gotten the report from the transport team, and so right off the bat,
Mm.
dehydration and lack of water in the habitats. And I say habitats, but they were wrecks. So dehydration and no water, an overabundance of feces and urates, multiple old sheds, and then levels of emaciation that ranged from 1, which is 1 out of 9 on the body condition scale. So 1 is severely emaciated, potentially near death, and 9 is morbidly obese, which could also cause death. So these animals many of the animals ranged from 1 to 3, and there were just a handful that were like 4s and 5s.
Mm.
So you've got the obvious dehydration, which means skin folds that aren't smoothing out, which means stuck shed, which means a dull appearance to the skin, tacky gums, meaning they're not pink and moist, they're sticky or dry completely.
Can I ask how did you scale the gums? Were you peeling the mouth back, or is that something you took to the vet to see
So
that?
they
Or
all went to the vet the very next day.
Mhm.
So they got here around midnight, and we took them in 2 groups the next day and the day after that. And the vet does a thorough exam of the mouth, the cloaca, the body condition, listens to the heart, all of that stuff. Some
Gotcha.
of them had mites. And while mite infestation alone is not a sign of abuse and neglect, because it's somewhat easy for normal good keepers to have mites,
Sure.
depending on where their snake came from. But that's just another layer when you're looking at the totality of the circumstances. And then fecal checks showed that some had internal parasites, or like single cell protozoa that shouldn't be there, or that there's an amount of bacteria in the feces that would be considered an overgrowth. So all animals tend to have some sort of bacteria and parasite load that's normal, but when
Mhm.
it becomes an overgrowth, then that's detrimental to their health. Some of them had respiratory infections, but surprisingly not many. A couple had stomatitis, which is mouth rot, and scale rot. So looking at all of those things in one single animal in someone's residence where all of the other animals are healthy and bright and alert and well fed, you might start to question, does this animal have an underlying health issue like a virus
Mhm.
or disease mechanism going on, or cancer? But when every single snake in the household is in similar conditions, along with the lack of cleanliness, along with no water in water bowls, along with multiple eliminations in an enclosure, multiple sheds in an enclosure, then you're looking at the totality of those circumstances and saying these animals are not being cared for, they're being neglected. Then another layer of that would be the cruelty or abuse. How do they behave around humans? Because you're looking for signs of emotional distress, psychological distress, or then you're looking for signs of physical abuse. Do they look like they've been deliberately had some kind of physical harm deliberately inflicted on them? And while these snakes didn't appear to have any deliberate physical harm inflicted on them, they were absolutely neglected, and some of them came with some clear emotional trauma. And then our investigators that were investigating via public information, via what they could find on social media, what they could find on
Mhm.
Facebook, found that some of the snakes were set loose and the cats were allowed to play with them. So now you're reaching a level of cruelty. to the snakes. So now if those snakes have not only emotional torment and abuse from being cat toys, but physical abuse if the cats bite them or claw them.
And so it's a totality. There's a whole picture that's being painted of what's happening, not just immediately with the animals. Because like you said, I could come on a snapshot on a bad day
Right.
and be like, wow, these snakes are in terrible conditions, but they look okay. Come back tomorrow and the conditions are fixed, it's gone, it's hey, there's never any problem here.
Right.
However, when we add up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and see these and these and these, there's no amount of fixing. Joy and Paul couldn't have gone back in a week or two and found a better situation. It was
Right.
really going to be the same.
Because they've been here, what, 6 months now, 5 months? And
Hmm.
now some of them are finally starting to gain muscle mass. So
Hmm.
there's no way that they could have gone back in 2 or 3 weeks or even a month and seen an improvement in the animal's condition. They could have seen an improvement in how they were being kept and maintained, but not in their physical condition in that short of time. And that's another thing you want to look at. If I come to your house and all of your snakes look fantastic, but they're all in like super dirty enclosures with no water, I'm going to ask why. Maybe you're in the hospital. Maybe there's been some kind of an
Hmm.
emergency and you haven't been present in a week or two to clean. That's much different than I come to your house and see those conditions, but also on top of that, the snakes are clearly physically ill, they're emaciated, they're dehydrated. So you're looking at the animal as well as the environment.
And I wanted to jump into something here too, because it's not exactly what we're talking. We're talking about spotting cruelty and neglect, but I also wanted to give you the credit you deserve too, because this is not a case that is, these are not evidence animals. Basically they were surrendered to avoid becoming evidence, which is a fairly common practice. Um, but if it's the case of an evidence animal or
Mm-hmm.
any kind of rescue, they need to be seen by a vet. They need to have a professional medical opinion to actually give a diagnosis of what the problem is. And so many people, and in fact, when the rescue was first discussed, it was never not an option that all of these animals would not go to the vet. There's a
Correct.
lot of double negatives there, but so thank you, for doing that, because so many people when they take an animal on, from someone else or they rescue it or any of these other cases, they're like, well, I don't know if I need to take it to the vet. It
They need
has
to go
to.
to the vet
If you're going to
because
be rescuing anything.
some of these animals 100% would not be alive today if they did not go to the vet.
Mm,
And even with our veterinary intervention, we unfortunately lost two.
yeah.
And of course, I and the vet did everything we could, but they were so far gone that we couldn't help two of them. And honestly, my husband says all the time, I'm surprised that you didn't lose more
Hmm.
because that's how bad they were. One needed actual fluid therapy at the vet because she was so emaciated and her pupils weren't even responding normally. She was that on the verge of death. And thankfully that animal did make it and she's still here. But absolutely they need to see the vet. Like
Yeah.
that's not even an option to rescue an animal from a cruelty or neglect and not take them to the vet.
Yeah.
And there's pros and cons of them being evidence animals too. If these snakes had been withheld, first of all, what could happen, depending on the officers, the knowledge of the officers there and the city or district attorney, the person could have been given a notice to cure. And I see this a lot with
Hmm.
equine cases. So yes, the animal is starved, it's emaciated, whatever, it's neglected, you have, and I give you a notice to cure, so I'm going to be back in 2 weeks or a month, and if things aren't improved, then you're going to be charged, or you're going to be we're going to confiscate the animals. And in those cases, sometimes, unfortunately for the animal, they needed something immediately
Hmm.
and they ended up dying during that time or going another month without care. And then if they're seized for evidence, sometimes it's limited as to what you can do with them.
Hmm.
And there's a chance the person can get them back, depending on how the court case goes, but they typically have to be held for evidence until the person is charged, goes to court, and the whole process has gone through the system, which means those animals are in limbo somewhere, and it may not be the best place for them, depending on where they go. Do they go to a hospital? Do they just go to an animal shelter? Do they go to a knowledgeable rescue or sanctuary? When they're voluntarily relinquished, then the animals go to, in this case, the best place that they could have gone, where they're going to get immediate care, they're going to get immediate veterinary care. And it was all on us to do that. We didn't need the court's permission to get the vet care. We didn't need, you know, the owner's permission. We just took these animals and we could, boots on the ground running, get them the care they needed immediately. So there are pros and cons to these different avenues that the animals could have ended up in.
Absolutely. And it euthanasia is something that is in my line of work a lot, and it is because when some things like this, for instance, I can recall a case of it was about 40 cats, kittens. Most of them were kittens, and unfortunately, they were seized from a location that obviously there was a humane case involved, but the animals were seized. And due to the fact of positive panleukopenia tests, they all had to be euthanized. And then that required all of the. I actually did it. I took the photos, not the euthanasia. I took each individual cat out of its box, took a photo for its kennel record, and just tried to comfort these poor animals for the brief moment that I had them. And it's an awful experience because they're very terrified to be where they are. They don't know what's going on, and unfortunately, their fears are essentially going to come true because of the neglect that they've been put into. And it's a sad result. So I think having a resource and sometimes having someone available for the animals in many cases is a better solution. It may sort of remove evidence, like we said, but in the same hand, it may actually save those animals' lives. So in some cases, we do the best with what we've got.
And working the veterinary side of things, there were many animals the Humane Society brought in that for euthanasia. And this was back before our local Humane Society had their own veterinary hospital, which they do now in-house. And they would just say this animal was seized in a cruelty case, but it's too far gone, and we've got all the evidence and photos or whatever we need, and we have to have it euthanized. And I'm pretty sure some of the snakes that we took in would have been in that category because of the expense of taking them to hospital and trying. Like we were of the mindset that if something could be done, we would try, because if the animal's going to be euthanized anyway, we might as well try to help it and give it that chance. And our vet, Dr. Liza Pfaff, is thankfully along those same lines. We've done surgeries on animals where it's like, well, we could euthanize the animal, or we could try this. And if you're going to euthanize it anyway, why not sedate it or put it under general anesthesia, try what we can do. And if it doesn't work or we get in there and it looks bad, we can euthanize under anesthesia.
Right. And I think the important thing there, because someone may agree with you or may agree completely with you. Someone may also disagree. They may say that, you know what, the animal is suffering and it's inhumane to keep trying things and we should euthanize. That's okay. People are allowed to have a difference of opinion. But the thing that matters here is that you had a veterinary professional with experience and knowledge in the specific field advising, to go one way or the other. So it's not just an opinion. It's not just
and she's very
Lori thinking something
about saying it wouldn't be wrong to euthanize this animal. She said that about several of the snakes. It wouldn't be wrong to euthanize this animal, but we could try this. Right. So it isn't like any of us are under the delusion that that's not on the table. But if there is a chance, and fortunately for animals like Belle, who was the one that was so dehydrated, she needed fluid therapy, and she was already becoming neurologic, and she's not a neuromorph. She has recovered. She's gained like 240 grams. She's eating well. She's target training. I can actually give you a video of her target training session from last night if you want to include it. That's a success story. And had we euthanized her that day, she wouldn't have her whole life ahead of her, and a good life, which she has now.
Right. That's awesome. Yeah. So, and what I want to do too is, because this is the interesting thing about this is that, um, I know when it was first taken on, there was a sort of an assumption that uh, Spirit Keeper Sanctuary would be sort of a halfway point. You'd bring the snakes in, and then they'd go to their forever places. And then once they were actually examined, you realize that there's a lot more that needed to be done for them. And so I'm gonna, so there, I know there's been a really great community response to fundraising, but there's still more that's needed. So I'm going to include links on how people can
Okay.
donate, and how they can, because there is also an option to donate directly to their medical care. Still, is that
Correct.
still a thing? Yeah,
Yes, you can call Critter Care Animal Hospital. These snakes have their own account there, separate
yeah,
from our regular sanctuary account, and it's their own account. And so anyone who calls there and says that they want their donation to go specifically to these snakes, um, they put it on their account. So when I go there and take one of the snakes in, they take off any credit before I pay the bill. It's really nice.
nice.
Really
It,
nice.
and then, just in case anyone doesn't know, I think everyone, well, I hope everyone that's watching might know, but this isn't, a portion of the proceeds go to care for it. Like, all the
No,
money goes to the animals. It's a nonprofit organization. It's all the money. So if you want to give $50 or $10 to help a snake, that $10 goes directly to
a
helping the
hundred
snakes. So
percent. Yes, 100%. Yeah, what happened in this situation, there was a team working with this person under the presumption that they became overwhelmed and they were had experiencing financial hardship and health issues. And I actually talked to this person, and they were going to send 12 snakes. And I'm not there, boots on the ground. I don't know what the situation is. And then we had Paul and Joy volunteer to go transport them, to give this person some relief and to help these animals. And so we were under the impression that the animals were okay, that there was nothing wrong with the animals, that they just needed to be rehomed to relieve this person's financial burden and health burden. But when Joy and Paul got there, it was clearly a cruelty and neglect situation. And they contacted me and said it's going to be like 30 snakes. And I'm like, well, and they said, they're really neglected. It's much worse than we thought. And then they met with law enforcement. And then the next day they went over there with law enforcement, and it was just, again, worse than they thought. And many of the animals were so bad that a few were near death, and they said they all have to go.
mhm.
All 67 of them need to go. None can stay here. It's that bad. And so while I thought we were going to take in healthy snakes and have them lay over here and then get them transported to rescues that can adopt them out, when they arrived here in the condition they were in, well, they were already where they needed to be, because we're a sanctuary for special needs animals. A
Right.
huge part of what we do is veterinary care, physical rehabilitation, emotional rehab, psychological rehabilitation. An animal doesn't get sanctuary admittance, permanent admittance, unless they have a special need or an issue where they're at risk. And so they got here, and clearly this is where they needed to be. So they didn't move on from here, because we can't send snakes in those conditions to a rescue to adopt them out, because they're not adoptable. So as they're becoming adoptable, I have a whole team now in place that's doing that. So we're handling that ourselves, which normally we don't do adoptions because we're a sanctuary, but now we have this special team that's formed that is just doing adoptions for these snakes as they get healthy.
And I know they're working very, very hard on that as well too. So it's really, nothing short of a massive effort from a lot of people. So, I don't want to dwell on that case too long, but, I think it's really, it deserves talking about, and you guys deserve credit for, the amount of work that you guys have put into it, because it's ongoing and
It is.
exhaustive. Yeah.
It is.
Um, so moving back to social media, a lot of us see questionable posts online. Maybe someone keeping multiple snakes in a tiny enclosure, or like you said, an animal that looks emaciated. Uh, What's the responsible thing to do when we see that? Should we call it out publicly? Should we message someone privately? Report it somewhere? What's your take on this?
I always think it's best to contact that person privately and have a conversation with them.
Hmm.
Have some discourse with them and say, "Hey, I noticed this post and um, I don't know where you're coming from. Uh this is who I am and whatever the circumstances is." So you mentioned having multiple animals in one enclosure. Just have a discussion about how for that species, whichever species it is that you're seeing, um, that's really not appropriate, blah blah blah. I mean, I don't know because I would need
Yeah.
to know the specific circumstance. But if I'm clearly seeing something, then I'm going to message that person privately and try to have like a non-agonistic conversation with them privately, so they're not being called out in public, because that makes people very uncomfortable and puts them immediately on the defensive. And if you're truly trying to help that animal or help that person, then you need to talk directly with the person involved. Now, if they refuse your help and they get nasty with you and they're deliberately saying, "Well, I don't care," or, "You're not going to tell me how to keep my animal," or it's clear that they're going to keep doing what they're doing, then you can call local law enforcement if you know where that person is and have a check the welfare done. Um, but if they're posting these things publicly on social media, then obviously they're opening themselves up to public scrutiny. And then you can make public comments. But I would just say keep those public comments evidence based, science based, fact based, and non emotional. Don't
Mm.
call the person names. Don't tell them they're horrible. Just say basically what you said to them privately, which should be professional and fact based. And you should have some sort of resources to back that up. If you're saying your animal looks dehydrated, you should have some source that backs up what dehydration in that species looks like and why you're saying that.
That's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. I think, and it goes back to something I mentioned earlier about these having legal definitions. So if you're going out and saying so and so is an abuser and they're harming their animals, you could potentially be slandering or
Mhm.
putting libel on yourself for putting it in print, for something that is not necessarily the case. Um, I think there's a lot of benefit. So to befriending someone and having an upfront, honest conversation, and to be perfectly honest, one thing that I do at work, at least when I was out in the field, again, I train officers now, but when I was in the field, um, some of the longest, most interpersonal conversations I ever had with anybody were some of the worst people I've ever met. just
Mhm.
just really genuinely selfish and scummy people, who were doing terrible things to their animals or their or just maybe not doing terrible things, but letting terrible things happen and not doing anything to stop it, neglect situations. And I at that point I become the best listener. I absolutely just hear them out, let them tell their story, let them tell their side. And frankly, it's genuine empathy. I'm not faking it. I
Mhm.
do feel for any human I could contact with. I may not ever associate with it and identify it or understand it fully, but I can understand feelings. And you have to get that in order for someone to be honest with you. You have to be able to listen, because if you start accusing them, if you start insulting them, start publicly shaming them, you lose that trust. And in many cases, when we want to get, especially when we're dealing with social media, there's a big divide between the real world and what we see online and social media.
Mhm.
And police can't do anything about social media. Not much. They can, with enough influence and with enough pressure, they can find it and they can maybe track down where this individual lives or how to find this person. But for the most part, they need a physical address.
Mhm.
So if you don't actually know where this abuse is taking place or this neglect is taking place, then you can't tell the police to go find it. in the city of Los Angeles, there's over 4 million people. So if someone calls and says, hey, they're in an apartment complex in downtown Los Angeles, and I know that they're kicking this dog every single day, they filmed it. It's awful, and you hate to hear that, but you also have to say, I don't know where that is. We can't necessarily pinpoint it down. We don't have those NSA zoom enhance things that you see on television to track down the physical address of someone just based on a video. But if there's an individual who takes the time to engage with this person, who maybe is local to them, is maybe able to meet them, maybe able to try and take the steps to help and find where the address is, and if help is not an option, then they could get law enforcement involved because they actually have those specifics. So I think being able to take off those accusation sort of
Mhm.
labels and jump away from that as a first reaction allows us to really get the information we need to investigate and actually get either a conviction or results. And I've always found it to be ironic, that I'll have interactions with people who are victims of a crime, and I need to be a little bit more upfront. Stop, please stop talking to me right now and listen to what I have to say. You're going to do this and you're going to do this, and I have to go. Goodbye.
Right.
But on the other hand, when someone is perpetrating crime, I'll let them talk. I'll let them talk. I'll let them talk. I'll let them talk, because they're going to eventually reveal more about themselves than they care to, and it's just an interesting dynamic between
I
the
also
different
feel like
levels.
I should mention that there's often going to be a different psychological profile for a person who's neglecting an animal and one that's
Hmm.
being committing cruelty upon an animal. And it would be the ones that are neglecting the animals that I feel like there's a better chance to talk to
Yeah,
and help. If someone's being deliberately cruel, I would be very careful about engaging with that person because they may be violent towards humans as well. And those may be the ones I'd be quicker to call law enforcement on, because if you call them out on cruelty, physical abuse, they can get very angry and then they can go escalate that abuse, whether that's on a person or an animal. And I would hate to be the cause of somebody inflicting even more torment on their animal. So
yeah,
you really,
absolutely. That's a great point. Yeah, the psychological differences, it's not the same, right? And that's why these words are so loaded. Sometimes telling someone, "Oh, you're an abuser," when all they've done, I'll put that in air quotes, all they've done is ignore the animal for many months on end
right,
due to their own personal sort of whether they draw within themselves, they've kind of shut the rest of the world out and have let their animals suffer while they let themselves suffer as well.
right.
That's one thing, as opposed to the abuse. The what is it, the power and control wheel. There's a ton of overlap between domestic violence, child abuse, and animal abuse.
Correct. So a
Anytime,
violent offender is going to have a different psychological makeup than someone who's neglecting
yes,
something.
yes, and that's something to be watchful too. If you know someone is neglecting and abusing animals, this is not someone that should be babysitting your children. This is not someone that you should be trusting vulnerable people with, privately, because these are coercive individuals, and pose a threat. And that, I think, that translates at every level. Whether it's, someone can neglect an animal, they can neglect a child. Someone can abuse an animal, they can abuse a child. So just these are definitely things to be mindful of. The overlap is very similar, and it's usually not the external issue. And in fact, many cases of animal abuse are, as you said too, they're actually abuse of a person. So someone doesn't let you feed your snakes because they want to control you and they want to control your time. So they say, no, you're always spending your time with them and you never spend time with me, and those sort of things. Or vice versa, or worse, I can't hurt you because I'm not a bad person that would hurt you, but watch what I'll do to your animal if you piss
Right.
me off again. Yeah.
It's really
And it's
disturbing. And honestly, kudos to you being in full-time animal law enforcement, because I don't I had to do it as part of my job in regular law enforcement, and I was always relieved to not have those cases because I dealt with regular human on human crimes easily, and professionally, I didn't have a problem with it, but when there was an animal case, man, those are the ones that got to me, and I
Mm.
don't know that I could do that full time.
Yeah, and it's funny because I see it the other way. I think of my friends who work at, even just like friends who are social workers who aren't necessarily on the criminal side, but they're a lot of times the
Right.
first call, and I'm just like I couldn't deal with the family stuff. That's it. So to each their own. It's
Mhm.
that's something. And funnily enough, when I wanted to do this job when I was younger, like in my early 20s. I thought about it, and then I spent one, like, not even a half hour volunteering in an animal shelter, and then it's just like crying pit bull after sad dog and a tiny kid. And I was like, nope, not for me. I can't do it. I'm not
And now
emotionally
you're
strong
doing
enough.
it.
Yeah, I went through some things as a human being, learned what real suffering is, and had some hardship in my life, and was able to, okay, I can compartmentalize a little better now as an adult and do it. But yeah, it's not something that I think anyone can jump into, because yeah, you have to be able to compartmentalize.
Mhm.
But I take some relief knowing that someone who gives a shit is doing it, as opposed to someone heartless or anything like that. So
Right. No, I agree.
it's supposed to hurt a little bit because it's sad stuff.
It's horrible. Yeah, it is.
But so kind of steering back to things that we see, what are some common things that maybe new keepers might, some common mistakes that the new keepers might be making that might look like abuse or neglect to outsiders, but are really just a learning curve?
I would say the fresh water, and
Hmm.
not scrubbing out the water dish. Like you're giving the animal water, but you're not scrubbing the dish every week or so, because depending on your water source, you can get algae in there, you can get calcification in there, you can get bacterial growth in there. So you're thinking, well, I give my animal water every day or I refill it every week, but you're
Hmm.
never cleaning the bowl. I think that would be easy, because also you might think, well, they drink water in nature and they drink it out of
Yes.
potholes or mud holes or creeks or ponds. And so I'm sure that my water dish is just fine because I don't wipe it out. And short term, of course that's not going to harm
Yeah.
your animal, but when you never clean it out, I think that becomes an issue. And also not routinely cleaning. So putting substrate in, putting your animal in there, if we're talking about a reptile or even a small mammal like a guinea pig or a hamster, they have to eliminate, like you're feeding it, you're watering it, you've got bedding in there. It's all that food and water you're giving it's coming out the other end. So you've
Hmm.
got to eventually clean that out. And if you don't eventually clean that out, and they're very good sometimes at hiding it, they'll go to the bathroom under the substrate, under a hide where you
Hmm.
won't see it. That's not really a problem, but you've got to clean at some point, or you're going to start getting bacteria and nasty things in there. And the air quality is going to degrade, and the animal could get a respiratory infection. And so I would say those are probably two things that would be easy for a new keeper to overlook, because out of sight, out of mind. I don't see all the waste,
Yeah.
so I don't know to clean it out periodically.
I think waste that's probably the one I had in mind when I was writing this question. I'm reminded of, so I don't know if you're familiar with Samson Pruitt, who owned Slither Inc. I believe he still
Well,
does.
I've heard the name, but
Yeah,
I'm not familiar with him. I couldn't even
he
tell you what he looked like, but
you're better off. He's a retic breeder who in that community, his name is infamous with sort of being accused of animal abuse, and just really horrific allegations, that are all true, that are just really disgusting conditions. One thing he was able to do when he was interviewed by his state police for animal abuse, was he was able to convince them that these animals live in bat caves that are just loaded with bat guano, and the high nitrogen environments, while it's disgusting it's toxic, you see, for humans to go into these caves, but the snakes thrive in them with the bats because that's what they're eating. And so that was his justification to the police as to why his cages were so gross and filthy, was that it was okay for them. And believe it or not, he was able to convince them that snakes are just nasty like that and that they liked it. Now, unfortunately, that same reasoning was also given to many new keepers, especially people that bought animals from him. And in a lot of cases, um, people believe sort of things like that. They sort of want to believe what they hear from these really bad influences. And so I think when we see people online that parrot this really terrible information, um, that's when it's important to sort of have a genuine conversation with this individual and say, hey, listen, the person you're taking advice from is a well-known um, uh, he's a convicted animal abuse. He has dog fighting convictions in the
Mhm.
past as well, because he bred like 90 or something crazy pit bulls that all had to be euthanized. It was just a horrible um, criminal record on his past. But it's like, so, listen, consider your sources, right? And now that you
Mhm.
do know better, now that you do know that a retic, while it's true they live in dirty bat caves, they also exit the cave occasionally.
Right.
They also get fresh water from a source that isn't, they're not drinking bat guano,
Right.
and all these other things. So hopefully in those cases education can really come into play. Another case that just reminded me as you were talking about was on the Facebook groups, and someone had a rainbow boa in a bioactive environment, but it was a fairly elementary. It was just isopods and springtails in the substrate, and it was a couple inches deep, not extremely deep, for a very relatively large snake. And over a period of time, after 6 to 8 months, something like that, the snake started to develop these little small burns on its belly, and then it started to get worse. Well, what had happened was they'd never done anything to change the substrate. There wasn't live plants, it wasn't a deep substrate. Um, Plants will help remove nitrogen from the soil. But realistically, not enough. Even if you have a very well planted environment, you still need to spot clean, and you'll need to replace substrate and add fresh substrate as well, because it's just not enough. They hadn't known
Right.
that. All they had learned was that with bioactive, you don't have to clean anymore. And so they didn't, and they never noticed anything. They presumably didn't notice that it started to smell a little funky, because it's
Mm.
going to start smelling like urine. But the snake was essentially just burning itself because most of the water was so heavily soaked with their urates and their urine and the nitrogen that comes from that,
Oh.
that the whole soil was, the pH had changed entirely, and it was basically a caustic soil that was burning them. And so it wasn't, it thankfully it didn't progress too
Oh.
bad. This keeper was quick to learn their mistake. They just didn't know any better, and they didn't reach out until there was a problem, which many of us do. So it was one of those things where it's like, yes, this animal was harmed. It became ill, but it was a simple mistake based on bad advice that they had gotten. And when they got the good advice, they remedied it, and the animal improved.
And
So
one of the things that I even learned with these recent snakes, because we've had to keep many of them on puddle pads or paper towels long term, because we're monitoring their elimination. One, that they are eliminating, and two, that we want them to be having normal stools and normal colored urates. But I knew that they also produce liquid urine, but I didn't realize the amount
mm,
of liquid urine snakes produce in addition to the solid urates and the feces. It's a lot of liquid urine. And now that I see that on the puddle pads, and my vet says, yeah, that's totally normal. They still produce liquid urine in addition to the solids. I now think, well, that's going into the soil. So even though
mhm,
I'm spot cleaning out the urates and the feces, there is still liquid urine that has soaked into that soil. And that's why it's important that you do that complete soil change out, not constantly, but periodically throughout the year,
yes.
because the liquid urine is going to be in that soil. I do see keepers that are the opposite extreme, that over clean. And so intruding into your snake's habitat too often is psychologically detrimental to them and
Mhm.
stressful to them. So you want to balance your hygiene with their emotional well-being. And I think that's something, how many keepers think about that?
It's tricky, and it's tough to do too, because they don't give you the same reactions that another animal, like our more mammalian friends will. So it's, yeah, it's tricky to balance. But I think of that as well, and it's going to be different per species. I think desert animals release less liquid than
They do.
tropical animals. And
And their habitats are easier to keep clean, like
mhm,
because the soil's dry.
mhm.
So it's going to absorb that liquid urine, but it's going to then any moisture is going to evaporate versus a rainbow bowl where you keep things moist a lot of the time. Oh, it's gonna build up bacteria and potentially fungus and other things so much more quickly than a desert or arid habitat.
Yeah. When I put them, if I ever need to put them in sort of a medical cage, which I've done, I think on 3 occasions, where I keep them on a paper substrate or a paper towel or like a really um, thin layer, like a thin layer of moss is kind of that's really what I've gone to the more recently because it's easier to change than the paper. Like because you have to change it
Right.
every 2 days. You have to keep it wet, and then on top
Mm-hmm.
of that, you have to keep it clean when they go to the bathroom. So
Mm-hmm.
it's daily, if not every other day's worth of work. So with those tropical species, it can be a lot if you need to keep them sterile because they don't keep it sterile.
No,
They
and
make a
when you
mess.
moisten paper towels or a puddle pad, you
Hmm.
can do that for a day or two, but then it's going to start to get mold on it. It's going to
Yeah,
start to get ick on it, and you've got to change that out and put a new one.
yeah, yeah. That's the other thing too, is it becomes its own. It becomes unstable pretty quickly as well, which is just all parts of the fun. That's why I kind of switched. The last time I needed to quarantine a snake, I just kept it on moss because that way I could switch it out like once a week and spot clean
Right.
a little better, and found that it was still close to sterile enough to monitor what was going because it's too much on the paper. Um, something I wanted to also jump into was what do you think? How do we encourage a culture in the reptile community where people feel safe asking for help? And we're speaking up about animal welfare, isn't seen as being a hater or causing drama, because those are a lot of the things that we see a lot of times is if you say something about someone else, it's you're hating or you're causing drama or just trying to put someone else down. But um, we know that's
Well,
often not the case.
so here's the thing on both sides of that spectrum is people need to ask for help. And then on the other side, if you see something, you need to say something. And both of those ends of the spectrum all come down to not worrying about your ego and not worrying about yourself, worrying about the animal. Ask yourself, what is the best thing for this animal in this moment right now? I'm not able to take care. This animal isn't getting what it needs with me. I need to ask for help. And I may be embarrassed to do that. I may feel like a failure doing that. I'm worried about what people will think of me. Whatever all the things are that's going through your head, you need to let go of that and
Mm,
do what's best for that animal because that animal didn't choose to live with you. That animal didn't choose to be born or be in captivity. And you are 100% responsible for its welfare. And once you take on that responsibility, you need to put that animal first.
mm,
To let go of ego and say, I need help.
yeah.
I just got too many animals, or I was taking great care of this animal, but now I lost my job and I want to keep this animal, but it's going downhill. I just can't do it. Do it. You need to let go of your ego and ask for help. And on the other end of that spectrum, you shouldn't be afraid to say something if you see a situation that's not in the best interest of the animal. Let go of what people are going to think of you. Don't worry about people getting mad at you. Um, how it might impact you, quite frankly, I don't care. I care about that animal before I care about you. So, what is best for that animal? And you need to let your own personal ego go and contact the person that's not keeping care of it appropriately and saying, hey, I'm really concerned about what I'm seeing with your animals. What can we do? And if that person's not open to that help, then don't be afraid to call law enforcement or call animal law enforcement or animal control or whatever the system is where you live. But we need to all let go of our ego and say what is literally best for this animal right this moment.
I think that's one of the best things, one of the best advice that I I feel like it was something I picked up from you was just when it came time to make decisions about where I wanted to go with what snake I acquired next, where some of my snakes went to live, and those sort of things. Was you had asked, you had said that the one question that you ask, and it's the only question that you ask a lot of times, is what's best for the animal.
Hmm.
And I think asking yourself that and genuinely answering it can be really difficult, and but when it's done, is it can be really important, and is you might surprise you when you say like, wow, that is not the answer I wanted to give myself, what's best for the animal is the only choice I have right now, because I need to do what's right. And earlier we talking about how to confront someone that has an issue, and you said it's probably best to just message them directly, to just talk to
Hmm.
them with um, and I kind of said, with kindness and empathy, and I think if you're in need of help, the same sort of rules apply. So it can be really nervous. Actually, right now on Facebook, I'll take that back, because on Facebook did something that I think is really great for animal welfare. I admin a couple of groups, and at first, when they came up with anonymous comments, I was pretty annoyed. I thought this was just, because I guess I'm a bit of an old guy, and any kind of change I don't like. Um,
Huh.
but what's wrong with speaking publicly? But what it's resulted in is now all of a sudden you get these quote unquote stupid questions, and you get these people who say, I know I should know better, but I had to ask. And they ask a question about an animal that really needs help, whether it hasn't eaten in months or
Hmm.
husbandry is way off. And I find a lot of times these anonymous posts are really great, at getting people to give answers. And sometimes, there's bad actors everywhere, and someone tells them, you should never have animals, and you're a terrible person, and you're anonymous because you suck. But for
Well,
the
and
most
that's where
part,
I would say whoever admins that group needs to just delete that comment,
absolutely,
because that's not helpful to the
absolutely.
animal or that person asking for help.
There's a lot of toxicity in a number of reptile groups, and there's a number of them that also do a pretty good job of shutting it down. And I think that's what most people need to realize too, which kind of cracks me up. About no hate, please, is something that says, they say before their comment, before they say
Which
something
means they're
totally
expecting
terrible.
it in the first place.
Yeah, they are, and it's the thing that I get hung up on is like, listen, the group says no hate. There's no hate allowed here. So you don't need to request it. All right. Like, this group is not going to hate on you. And if they do, they're going to get removed, because that's not what we're here to do. And I think people just need to uh, take a moment to find just a little bit of courage, and ask the question they need to. But if they don't want to do that, if they don't want to go anonymous, if they don't want to subject it to the comments, even though their name isn't attached to it, message someone directly. Find
Mhm.
someone you respect who does know, and ask them for their advice. I've done that so many times, and that's the way I prefer to get advice, because when I would first post to the groups and ask questions, I'd get 250 different answers, and I'd have to kind of read through and say, okay, who knows what they're talking about, and
Mhm.
hopefully I can find the right advice. And I was just realizing this isn't doing it, and so I found a few
Right.
knowledgeable people and just messaged them directly. And I think that is such a valuable resource. It's something I've talked about on this channel before, is find someone that you could consider a mentor, and find someone that you look up to, and find someone that's knowledgeable, and ask them directly for help, because that's the only way you're going to get it. and
Mhm.
and vice versa. um, Talking about the cruelty and those sort of things, if we recognize something, like you said, if you see something, say something. It doesn't always mean saying something to law enforcement or saying something directly to the person. Sometimes letting other people know, and getting other people's opinions on a subject too can really help, because you may say, hey, am I tripping, or does this look like a really bad case?
Right.
And someone say, no, dude, you're tripping. Like, that's totally fine. That's what ball pythons do, and you just don't know because you've only had the one, or whatever it is. But if you get more eyes on it, they're like, well, what should we do? What have they asked you? And then you could sort of crowdsource it. So
Mhm.
just be willing to share. We share so many of the positive things. We also need to be able to share the negative things, and feel safe to do that, so that we can ask for help.
And I would tell people to put yourself in a position where you're unwell where you're in a position where you need help as an individual, would you want people to see that you're being neglected, that you're being abused, that you don't have what you need to live as a human being and have an adequate life, and to just walk by and say, well, I don't want to get involved?
Hmm.
You wouldn't want that if that was you.
Hmm.
You know,
No.
if I was being kept in a bedroom with no furniture and just a water source and given food once a day, and somebody found me in there, I wouldn't want them to turn a blind eye. I wouldn't want
Right.
them to say, oh, well, she looks okay and somebody else will help her.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially that's an easy example because you're a human being too. Um, but now imagine too that your ability to speak has been taken away, your ability to express your emotions in a clear communication has been taken away, and it's just up to someone else. One thing I've said throughout my career, across all the different jobs I've had, is if it's not you, then who?
Mhm.
Meaning, if you don't say something, then who will? Because
Right.
if you're just counting on the random next guy, if it's not like a specific person, it's not going to happen. So if it's someone's job to do something, and you want to pass up so that they could do it, fine. But if it's not, then do it. I used to tell employees when I worked at Enterprise Rent a Car, like, don't just walk by that piece of trash in the parking lot that's floating over there. The McDonald's bag or whatever it is.
Right.
Pick it up and throw it in the dumpster because every other customer walks by that. If you don't
Right.
throw it away, who will?
Right.
And you could see these 19-year-old kids eyes click when they're like, oh, I get it, yeah, I got to do it because no one else is going to do it. And it's the same thing with this animal abuse. If you don't do it, who's going to do it? If you
I
don't
mean, that
report it,
animal literally has zero control
right?
over anything. It 100% depends on us.
And the worst thing that's going to happen, if you make a noise about it, is that you're uncomfortable for a little bit, just a little bit. Like just a little bit of social awkwardness, as opposed to possibly a lifetime or a death, for an animal, a lifetime of suffering. So just
Right.
take a moment if you see something to say something, and say something to someone who can do something about it, whether it's a friend with more resources, or if it's going to law enforcement, or if it's going directly to the person. um,
Right.
I think there's action you can take. It's just, I think, standing by and continually seeing bad actors in the hobby, and not saying anything about it is the biggest problem. I have a lot of issues with the number of people that have gone in and out of that Slither facility, that didn't that somehow this man has not gone to jail for his crimes is beyond me. But it's because no one said anything, and that's ultimately where we come down from. So, um, curious
Yeah.
stuff
I mean, you're
sometimes.
preaching to the choir here, because I'm always going to ask what's best for that animal and how can I get that animal out of that situation as soon as possible. And I'm going to start out privately, but if that doesn't work, I'm not stopping. And I don't care how, like, I'm going to feel worse if I don't do something.
Right.
And that's just my personality. If I let that go and I don't do something, then I'm going to not be able to sleep at night. And so I don't
Yeah.
really care what other humans think of me. I care that that animal is taken care of.
Right. I think that's what clicked for me too, was in some cases of staying up literally all night worrying about an interaction that I had, and should I or shouldn't I do something about it. I was like, you know what, this is a very clear answer that I should do something about it because
Right.
I can't rest.
Right.
And it may not be that way for everyone. Some people may be able to walk right on past something and never think about it again. But I would encourage everyone to stop, and like you said, put yourselves in that position. It's not easy for humans to empathize with animals, but if you can do it, stop and take a moment and just think about it. You don't have to necessarily, think like a snake, but put yourself in their skin,
Try to
and try
see
and live it.
things from their worldview, from their umwelt. And that's, I mean, for people not familiar with Temple Grandin, that is how she got
Mm,
her start with food animal behavior and helping improve the lives of food animals. She would literally go to some of these slaughter plants and lay down on the floor, walk on the ramp, put herself literally physically in the position that the animal would be walking up the ramp on or sitting in their pen on, and seeing the world from their literal vantage point, and things would click with her. Oh, the animal's scared to walk through here because if you're sitting where the animal would be, there's this glint on this mirror and it's impairing their vision. And so I'm just saying, if you put yourself in that animal's shoes, in that animal's skin, if that in that animal's fur, um have a little empathy for them. It may make it easier for you to say something and do something, or to support that person that asked for help, and not say, well, that's your own fault, you got in that position, and that's on you. Don't be like that. If somebody's asking for help, you don't even have to like that person, you're doing it for the animals.
mhm. Yeah, I think well, it's a wonderful place to close up on. So thank you so much for that. Lori, thank you so much for helping shed light on this topic. I know it's a heavy one, but I think it's one of the more important conversations we could have as a community. And not just you and I, but for everyone too. So I hope not just people watching this, but folks can also discuss amongst their own groups and those sort of things about the state of cruelty and neglect in our own hobby, and how to look out for it. To those of you watching, remember the health and welfare of our animals should always come first. Do what's right, what's best for the animal. That's the question that you taught me to ask. What is best for this animal? It's a simple one, but it can have a big, meaningful impact. If you did like this conversation, I'm going to do the YouTube thing. Do hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't already, because most people that watch are not subscribed. Again, I'm Stephen Lewis. This is Let's Talk Herps. And as always, I hope you enjoyed learning something. And thank you so much, Lori, for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.